So welcome to this tutorial series on learning Python from WiseR Training. In this tutorial you'll learn about installing and using Visual Studio Code. As always, you'll be able to click on the little information symbol at the top right of your screen to download files and exercises for the tutorial you're watching, but actually there aren't any exercises for this particular one. But I think that's enough of me speaking. It's time to hand over to my electronic avatar, Electronic Andy, who will take you through the rest of this tutorial. So here's what you'll learn in this tutorial. We'll begin by looking at installing Visual Studio Code. You won't be able to do much without that. We'll look at choosing a theme, and then we'll look at installing Python, so that you can program in Python. Visual Studio Code allows you to program in lots of languages, but they have to be installed. We'll look at the terminal window, which you can use not only to see the output from programs that you run, but also to run single-line commands. And then we'll look at creating file programs just like we did in idle, so that you can run multiple statements at the same time. We'll look at installing the Code Runner extension to make it easier to run programs. And then we'll look at the important topic of how to change your settings in Visual Studio Code. And then what I'll do is take you through some suggested settings you might choose to impose. And finally, we'll have a look at 5 tips for becoming more productive in Visual Studio Code. So let's get started. So if you want to be able to use Visual Studio Code on your computer, you're certainly going to have to install it. And here's how to do that. So you could run a search for VS Code. It saves typing. And if you click on Google Search or whatever search engine you're using, go to the first result returned almost certainly, you'll be looking at the Visual Studio Code website. I can click on the drop arrow next to this download button to see possible options. I could install it for an Apple Mac or for Linux, but I'm going to go for the default option, which is a stable build for Windows. So if I click on that button, what it will do is begin the download process, and it won't even give me time to tell you a good joke before it finishes on my machine. So there's the executable downloaded, and now I can open it, and what it will do is run the installation process. I can accept the agreement, always wondered what happens if you don't, put it in the default location, and give it the default name. I'm going to tick these extra boxes because I possibly want to be able to double click on a Python file to run Visual Studio Code. I have to be honest, I'm not quite sure of the results of that. And then if I click on the next button, I can begin the installation process. And considering it's a 300 megabyte program, it's actually really quick. And you can see there it's finished. And what I'm going to do now is click on the Finish button to launch Visual Studio Code. And you can see if I go to my list of programs, Visual Studio Code is installed. So this is the opening page you see when you go into Visual Studio Code, and we're just going to do 2 quick things. The first is to choose a theme. There are so many ways to change your theme, and later on in this tutorial I'll show you some of the alternatives. But for now, if you click on Browse Color Themes, and it's basically a choice of whether you want to be on the dark side or the light side. I want to be on the light side, so I'm going to choose Light Visual Studio. And this is the theme I'm going to use for the rest of this tutorial series. The second thing I was going to show you is how to get it so this irritating welcome pop-up doesn't appear all the time. And to do that, you can go to the settings icon at the bottom left corner of your screen. You can click on that and choose to change your settings. You can type in Startup. You can choose from the drop list for the Workbench Start Editor that you want to see nothing. The other options would just irritate me, I'm afraid, but then I'm easily irritated. I can then close down this window and also close down the welcome window. And this is what I'll see when I go back into Visual Studio Code. It will always show you some helpful shortcuts in the background just to nudge you in the right direction. What I want to do now is show how to install Python in Visual Studio Code, because at the moment it's not actually available. So to do this, at the top left of your screen you have something called the activity bar. And this provides a way to do some of the most common tasks in Visual Studio Code. The 2 most interesting things are probably the top icon, which allows you to create and open files and folders, and the bottom icon, which allows you to install extensions. And that's exactly what we want to do now, so I'll click on it. Now normally this list will take a while to appear, but because I've already pre-prepared this, it should appear almost immediately. But just zoom in for a second, you can see that the most popular program by far is Python, with 39.9 million downloads. But there's 28,816 extensions in total, so whatever you want to do in Visual Studio Code with regard to programming, the chances are you'll be able to. To install Python, you just click on the Install button to the right of it, as you might expect, and it only takes a few seconds. It's going to install IntelliSense, which will give me the ability to autocomplete commands, linting. I must admit that was a new word for me. What it basically means is error checking, and debugging, which will allow me to step through my Python programs. And I clearly haven't been speaking quickly enough because it's already installed. It says it's enabled globally. We'll come, when we talk about virtual environments in a later part of this tutorial series, we'll see the implications of that. You only ask for one thing, but you've got three. You've got Python, you've got the Pylance, which gives you all those extras I was talking about, and you've got something called Jupyter Notebooks, which as far as I can see is a bit like Notepad. So that's how you install Python. The next thing we're going to do is run a program, and to do that we need to learn about the terminal window in Visual Studio Code. So what I want to do now is to run a command in the terminal window. Now, to bring up the terminal window, I think the easiest way is to hold down the Control key and press the apostrophe symbol. And when you do that, it alternately hides and displays the terminal window. So you can see that I pressed it to hide it, and if I press it again, it will display it again. There's another key you can press, which is Shift, Control and apostrophe, and this does something slightly different. When I press that, it opens up another instance of the same terminal window. So you can see that every time I press it, I'm getting on the right hand side here an additional terminal window. So what I'm going to do is hover my mouse over the second and third one I created and kill it or delete it. So I'm back to the individual single command window. To run a command in Python, what I need to do is first open up the Python interpreter. And I can do that by typing the command Python in. When I press return, you can see something Python-y has happened. I can then type in any valid Python command I like at the command prompt. Essentially, this is just like idle was in the first part of this tutorial series. So for example, if I want to print out the noise an owl makes, why change a good example? I can type in a valid Python command and press the Enter key, and it will give me the output of my command. When I've finished typing Python code, I can type exit and open and close brackets. And what that will do is close down the Python interpreter and take me back to the command window. So when I press return, you can see I'm back in just the terminal window. So for example, I could type in CLS to clear the screen. It won't work in Linux, I don't think, but it will work in Windows. What we're now going to do is write a more ambitious program to span multiple commands, and for that we need to create a file. So what we're going to do now is to create our first proper program. Okay, it will probably only print out to wit to woo, but the principle's there. To do that, we need to firstly open up a folder. So you can see I've got the button there to open a folder, and if I click on that, what it will do is give me the chance to choose where I'm going to put my code. So I've got a folder set up called tutorial. I'm going to open that and select it, and these icons appear. The one I'm going to click on in the moment is the left-hand one, which I've got selected there. And what that will allow me to do is to create a new file. And it gives me a chance to name my new file. So I'm going to call it Noisy Owls again. I'm going to put .py and press return. It's absolutely vital you remember to do this, because if you don't, it won't be treated as a Python program file by Visual Studio Code, and you won't get any IntelliSense and nothing will work. So please do remember to do that. So as before, I'm going to type a comment in. So I'm going to say make owl noises. You may be experiencing a sense of deja vu here. And you can see the comments in Visual Studio Code are a different colour, they're green. Otherwise, the principle is exactly the same. So I'm going to print out my two commands. You can see lots of help appearing on screen as I do this, not all of it useful at the moment. So there are a couple of ways to run a program in Python. One is to click on this little green triangle at the top corner of the screen. And what that will do is run the program and send the output to the terminal window. Would be to choose the Run menu, and there's two options on this. You can either start debugging with the F5 key, or you can click Run without debugging with the Control F5 key. Now, I don't particularly want to debug it. I don't want to step through it line by line because I'm pretty certain there's no bugs in my program. So what I'm going to do is use the keyboard option and press Control F5. And what that will do is not only open up a new terminal window, but display the output of my program in it there. Now what I would like to do is to have the output appearing in a clean output window instead. And to do that, we're going to install the Code Runner extension as the next part of this tutorial series. So what I'm going to do now is to show you how to install the popular Code Runner extension, which will not only make it easier to run your programs, but also make it easier to interpret the output. So to do this, I need to go to the bottom icon on the activity bar on the left-hand side of Visual Studio Code, and I can then choose to search for the Code Runner extension. You can see I've got that pre-typed in. So the Code Runner extension has been downloaded at the time of speaking 8.4 million times, so it has to be a good thing. So I'm going to click on the Install button. This will happen almost instantaneously because I previously installed it on this machine, but even the first time I installed it, it only took a few seconds. So I can now close down this tab because I no longer need it. And to get rid of this confusing information about extensions, I'll just go back to the Explorer icon. So what I can now do is to run my program. Now there's two ways to do this, two obvious ways anyway. The first way is to use the same triangle I clicked on before at the top right of the screen. But this time you can see there's two options. The first one will run your code using Code Runner, and the second one will use the default method and send the output to the terminal window. So the other way to run a program is to use a shortcut key, and that's the way I'll be using for the rest of this tutorial series. The shortcut key in question is Alt-Control-N. And what that will do is not only create a new instance of the terminal window if necessary, but also send the output to the output window. I suppose it's a bit annoying that it has this line at the beginning and this line at the end. And possibly another annoying thing is that if I run the program again, by pressing Alt-Control-N again, it just adds the output onto the end of what's already there. What we'll do in the next part of this tutorial is I'll show you how to change some of the settings to make Code Runner behave in a more amenable way. What I want to do now is look at how you can change your Visual Studio Code settings to make Visual Studio Code work better for you. It's a really useful thing to do. We're going to do it in two parts. In this first part, I'll show you my preferred way to change your settings, and in the second part, we'll look at some useful settings that you could adopt. So I promised you at the beginning of this tutorial that we'd look at how you can change your theme different ways. And so what I want to do is show you 3 or 4 different ways for changing your theme to give you some idea of what's possible in Visual Studio Code before we go into more detail looking at settings. So the first way would be to click on the gear icon at the bottom corner of your screen and choose Color Theme. So this is very specific to changing themes. I could choose the one I wanted from the list. The second way to do it would be to click on the gear icon again, but this time choose Command Palette. Now, not many people actually do that because there's a shortcut key allocated to it instead. So what you can do is press Shift-Control-P, and what it will do is bring up the command palette at the top of the screen. Now this is incredibly useful because you can type in virtually anything you want to do. So for example, if I want to change the theme, I can type in the word theme, and you can see the first option there is to change my preferred theme. And if I click on that, I can choose a different one from the list. So we'll be seeing the command palette over and over again throughout this tutorial series for ways to do things in Visual Studio Code. So a third way to change your theme or any other settings is to click on the gear icon one more time, and this time choose Settings. And it comes up with a form with a menu on the left hand side here. But rather than use this menu to try to find what you're trying to do, the best thing to do is just click in the search settings box at the top and type in part of your word. So I've typed in theme in this case. And what that will do is bring up a list of everything to do with themes on the right hand side. And you can see there I've got my workbench color theme, and I can click on the drop arrow and choose the one I want. And that's a reasonably good way of changing your settings. What I'm now going to do is show you what I consider to be the best way. Now before we can do that, I need to introduce you to these tools at the top right of the screen. So let's just zoom in on that. The one on the right hand side is for splitting your screen, and I only mention this because I keep clicking it by mistake, and whenever you do, it creates another tab. So you end up with loads of different tabs open and have to keep shutting them down. So perhaps you're less cack-handed with your mouse than I am, but I keep doing that. The one I want to look at instead is the one in the middle, and what that will allow you to do is to open up your current settings in JSON, JavaScript Object Notation, since you ask. And initially this looks like a step backwards. How on earth are you going to work out what to do in this? For your existing settings, it's probably easier than you think it's going to be. Because, for example, if I want to change my theme here, I can get rid of what I've typed in there. And when I type a colon, it will prompt me for all the possible values for the property I'm setting. So it's not as hard as it looks. But still, for new properties, you're left guessing. So what I want to do is remove the guesswork, in fact. And to do that, I'm going to get you to type in an extra comma after your last property. And this is the only time where I'm going to get you to actually type in something where you're guessing what you want to do. So we want to change the default settings. And so if you type in default set, that should be enough, and press the tab key, it comes up with a property which says workbench.settings.openDefaultSettings equals false. Controls whether opening settings also opens an editor showing all the default ones. And we're going to change that to be true. Your settings file is unsaved at the moment, and the reason I can tell that is it's got a little black circle to the right of it. So what I'm now going to do is to close that down, save my changes, and I'll close down the original tab as well. So what's the effect of what you've just done? Well, let's find out. If you go to the Gear tab at the bottom left corner of Visual Studio Code and choose Settings, it will come up with the standard form. If you then go to the icons at the top right, and if you choose, as we did before, to view them in JSON view, then what you'll see is a text representation of your settings. Here they are. But what you'll also see alongside it is the default settings, everything which is possible. And there's an awful lot of them. If you press Control End to go to the end of the block, in my version I've got nearly 5,000 lines of settings. Some of them must be useful. So I'll press Control Home to go back up to the top, and I'll see if I can find a useful one. So let's suppose that you want to change your autosave. I'm going to do a search by pressing Control F, and I'm going to search for the word autosave. Now I'm going to cheat slightly here because I know the first one isn't actually the one I want, so I'll just go to the next one. And then what I'll do is go to the left-hand side and have a look at what's available. So you can see that not only is there an autosave property, but there's also an autosave delay, and there's loads of comments explaining how they work. I might as well keep them. So I'll copy all those, and then I'll go to my actual settings on the right hand side, and the only thing you have to remember to do is to type in a comma so that it's still syntactically correct. So then I can paste in my settings, and I can now start changing them. So my file autosave, I don't even have to read the lines of comment above. I can just type the colon in and it will give me the possible values for it. So for example, I might choose after delay. Underneath that, I could change the delay itself. So for example, I might want it to come up in 2 seconds and not 1, and so I could change that. You can leave the trailing comment, though I always feel slightly uncomfortable doing so, and take it out. But if you leave it in, then the next time you paste in some more settings, you won't have to remember to type it in. Now, I actually don't want to keep those settings, so what I'm going to do is to close my file without saving it. But if I wanted to keep them in, then I would have just enabled autosave. Now is just run through the settings I use for Visual Studio Code, just to give you some inspiration perhaps. And you can download this file from the Wisar website using the link shown on this video. To find out where to copy it to, you can just right click on the settings.json file and choose Reveal in File Explorer. And what that will do is show you the location of where it's stored on your computer. So the first thing I do is change my theme. I then stop the startup page appearing because it annoys me. I must admit I didn't actually add this, it was added by Python, and it just makes sure that it can find where the Python interpreter is stored. Once you start using virtual environments, I suspect that line will become unnecessary. I bigger so that everyone can read it watching the videos, and then I give myself the opportunity to be able to change the font by using the mouse wheel with the control key. That's what I'm doing at the moment. This is the line we were talking about earlier. I make sure that the default settings appear alongside the normal settings when you open them up. And then a couple of bolshy settings. I don't see why I should send information to Microsoft, so I've turned those options off. It's called telemetry. Occasionally in Visual Studio Code, there's an irritating pop-up appear at the bottom of the screen to do with screen readers, and this just makes sure that I don't get that appearing. You may find it isn't an issue for you. And equally, you may use a screen reader, in which case you'll certainly want not to set that option. And then the rest of the lines are to do with Code Runner. So I'll show you the effect of these in a second. What this does is make sure the output window is cleared each time I run a program. This makes sure I run an entire file and not just the code I've currently got selected. And this line of code and this one make sure that when I run a program it saves the current file but doesn't save any others I've got open. And finally, this line, or this setting line, suppresses any other messages. So let's see this in practice. If I've got two files open, what I'm going to do is make a change to this one, familiar one. And this circle shows that both of the files have got unsaved changes. I'm going to select just this line of code, and I'm going to choose to run my program. And if you watch what happens, all the things I've requested have happened. It's run the whole program, and not just the line of code I had selected. It's saved this file, but hasn't saved any other files I've got open. It's cleared any other messages from the output window, and it's also suppressed any other execution messages so I get a nice clean output. So that's the settings I like to have set up in Visual Studio Code. There are so many ways in which you can make yourself more productive in Visual Studio Code, but let's just look at 5 tips, 5 of the most important. I'll show you how to comment code in and out. We'll look at using multiple insertion points. We'll look at a quick way to rename variables. We'll look at expanding and collapsing your code easily. And finally, I'll look at something called Zen mode, which is where you can get an almost completely clear screen. I'm not a big fan of it, but who knows, you may be. So we'll start with looking at commenting and uncommenting code. And to do this, can I get you please to type in a couple of extra lines of code? I have a slight ulterior motive for doing this. I want to show you 2 or 3 more things about Code Runner. So we'll create a variable called owl noise, and we'll set it equal to the response to the question, what noise does an owl make? Then we'll display the value of this variable. And when you type in the name of the variable, it will come up with an alphabetical list of all the variables you've added to your program, and you can press Tab key to choose the one you want. And that's one of many benefits of using Visual Studio. So that's my program. What I'm now going to do is to try running it. So if I press the usual shortcut key or Control N, it comes up with the question, what noise does an owl make? And there are 2 problems with this. The first one is there's absolutely no way to answer the question because I'm using the output and not the terminal window. And the second problem is if I try running my program again, you'll see that it says the code is already running. At the bottom right corner of the screen, there you can see it now. And so the reason that's happening is because it's waiting for the response to the previous question. And so another shortcut key in Code Run is Alt-Control-M, and what that will do is stop any program you're currently running. So you cannot use the input function in Code Runner. It's a very small price to pay. Personally, I never use it. I only showed it to you in the first part of the tutorial series as a way of introducing variables. And so what we're going to do is to comment out those lines of code. You don't even need to select full lines of code. What you could do is just select part of each line and then choose Edit from the menu and choose Toggle Line Comment. Although nobody bothers doing it the menu way, it's much easier just to press Ctrl and the / key. And what that will do is comment out, put a hash in the start of, every line which is partially or completely selected. If you press Ctrl / again, it just reverses the process. So that's the quickest way to comment and uncomment lines of code. So the second thing I wanted to show you is multiple insertion points. I'll just give you a couple of examples of how you can use these. Supposing, for example, you wanted to change the variable from owl noise to owl sound. One way to do that would be to click at the beginning of the noise in the first variable, and then hold down the Alt key and click at the beginning of the second one. There's actually a better way to do this, which I'll show you shortly. So if I now press the delete key 5 times and type sound in instead, that will appear at every single insertion point. So that's one idea. Another idea is supposing I wanted to comment each of these lines of code out. Now I've shown you a better way to do this as well, but sometimes this can be useful in other contexts. What I can do is press Alt, Control and the down arrow key, and what that will do is add in an additional insertion point. And if I repeat this a second time, I've now got the insertion point flashing at the beginning of each of the selected lines. So anything I type in now will appear at the insertion point. So that's another way to comment out loads of lines of code. And if I want to reverse the process, I can just backspace to get rid of those. And again, I can just press the Alt key to take me out of multiple insertion mode. My favourite shortcut keys in Visual Studio Code is using the F2 key to rename variables. I promised you I'd show you a quick way to do this. So let's suppose I want to reset this variable back to owl noise. I can double click on it to select it, and then I can press the F2 function key. And that will bring up a box like this, and I can type in the new name, or rather old name for my variable, and at this point I've got two choices. If I press enter to rename it, it will rename it wherever it occurs, so that's nice and easy. The other choice I've had, if I go back into that by pressing F2 again, is I'll just rename it back to owl sound, or attempt to. I can press shift and enter, and if I do that it comes up with the refactor preview window, and what I can do in this is I can tick or untick each change I want to make. Now it's not obvious what's going on, but if I click on any of these lines, it comes up with a window on the right hand side where I can see the changes I'm about to make. It's remarkably easy to do. Now I actually don't want to make any of these changes, so what I'm going to do is go over to the right here, and rather than clicking on the tick, let's just zoom in on that, which would make my changes, what I'm going to do instead is discard them, and I'll be back to where I was. To show the fourth of the 5 tips I wanted to go through, which is expanding and collapsing code, I've opened up a file we were working with in the previous part of this tutorial series. I don't think there's any need to do this yourself, it's really just a question of writing down the shortcut keys. So if I want to expand or contract part of the code, I can press Shift Control and the forward square brackets key. And it's much easier to see the effect of it than it is to describe what I've just said. You can see that it collapses part of the code. If I want to reverse that, I can press Shift, Control and the close square bracket symbol, which will reverse a process. Now to do that for each of the clauses of this if statement would take a while. Unfortunately, there's a quick way to do all of them in one go for the whole of your code program. To do that, I can press Ctrl K followed by Ctrl 0, so there are two key sequences one after the other. And when I decide that I want to reverse those two, I can press Ctrl K followed by Ctrl J, and that will expand all your code. For simple programs like this, maybe it's not so useful, but it will be as your programs become more complicated. The final thing I wanted to show under tips is personally something I wouldn't use myself. You can go into Zen mode. And to do that, you choose View from the menu, choose Appearance, and choose Zen mode. And you can see there's a shortcut key for this as well. And what Zen mode is everything else disappears from your screen and you can concentrate on your programming. At least that's the idea. Personally, I don't find it very useful. To exit Zen mode, you have to press the Escape key, not once, but twice in a row, and you'll be back in normal code view. And that completes this series of tips, and indeed this tutorial.